Hello, everyone. Next up, we have a pre-recorded speech with Prasanna Las, which is called "The Contours of Data Policy Today." Because of new technology, influx of data is bigger and faster than ever. That has its benefits, but also its cons, some of which are privacy related. So Prasanna will cover in his talk some of these concerns and how they're handled worldwide. We can start the presentation. Regarding the Q&A session, Prasanna will catch up with all the questions on Discord later today. So feel free to send those questions on the Discord. We can start.
How have the mighty fallen? Data was till recently considered the ultimate public good. Social and political activists saw it as a tool for more openness and accountability. Governments and civil society organizations trumpeted innovative data-driven ways of delivering services. Investors loved the return on data companies. And for one brief moment, big data was actually a good word. The tide has turned since then. And today, discussions on data are dominated by concerns about data privacy and protection, the unfair monopolies in many data-driven markets, the risk of exclusion that many minority populations face, the rise of state surveillance, the unethical uses of data, and the general consensus that we as human beings have become products or subjects of data, that we exist to serve and provide data rather than gain from it. When during the pandemic, life continues to be productive for many people and their children, you marvel at the power of data-driven tools. But in the back of your mind, you also worry that your data is not safe, your privacy is being compromised, your children are being screened, and that you're losing your agency. Let's spend the next 20 or so minutes unpacking some of these issues. I'm fully aware that watching a talking head droning on lifelessly is nobody's idea of fun, but I really hope that you can bear with me as I work through the following ideas. 1. For all the talk of big data, much of our economy is still not really datafied. In most sectors, it is the lack of data rather than too much data that is the problem. 2. Data policy and privacy and protection have emerged as central policy issues. But the real story of data policy is much larger, and we need to take a much broader view of data policy that covers issues like data infrastructure, but also policies that promote the ethical and sustainable use, access to, and sharing of data, help establish trust in the data ecosystem, develop the capacity of society to not just consume data-driven services, but also understand their vital power in it, and create institutions that enable us to derive value from data in equitable fashion. The third point I hope to make is that significant policy disagreements characterize many fundamental data policy issues. There is still no consensus on good practice when it comes to issues such as data localization and sovereignty, intellectual property, data sharing, ownership, and many others. 4. Vulnerable populations such as women, children, minorities, and LGBTQ face a daunting data environment. Policymakers have a critical role in keeping and creating safe and trusted spaces for them. And 5, international cooperation is the need of the hour, but the portents are not especially promising. For all the theoretical discussions of data partnerships, we are at the moment living through a very fractured data environment. Where does that leave us? Where does that leave developing countries, and what models of public-private cooperation are required? This is obviously a very broad brush with which to paint data policy issues, and I will be happy to connect with anybody afterwards for a closer, more analytical, or more critical look at anything you like. Meanwhile, let's start with the state of data, which is characterized which is characterized by the explosion in data availability. And we're not talking just the millions of emails, videos, texts, Zoom calls that generate hundreds or thousands of gigabytes of data per second. Machines have actually joined in the act as well. And earlier this year, perhaps for the first time, machines produced more data than human beings. There might already be 4 network devices for each one of us, and this number will continue to grow in the favor of machines. Also, in a significant departure from the past, the private sector generates and owns much of this data. This is very different from the story of data through history, in which the state exercised control over most data. This is not to say that the influence of the state has waned. Quite the contrary, in fact. And as we will discuss later, uh, the role of the private sector does create a new dynamic in the story of data. Why does all this data and data policy matter? Policymakers realize that data is at the heart of all modern disruptive technologies, including artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, the fourth industrial revolution, blockchain, and many others. And that is governance is going to be a key facet of development in the future. These technologies make it possible to develop and deliver services that are more efficient and better optimized, that help target the delivery of these services much better than in the past. Data is also the core ingredient in new public and commercial goods and services. The value of data actually in many industries often outstrips the value of physical assets. Tesla, which essentially sells the data hungry computer on wheels, for instance, has eclipsed the value of many erstwhile stars of the automobile industry. Tesla actually sells 98% fewer cars than Ford and GM. However, the company has amassed over 1 billion miles of autopilot data as it treats each vehicle as sensors. And that is where the value comes from, not from the physical cars themselves, but the data is actually generating. So sectors such as e-commerce, travel, and transportation have been transformed by data. But unfortunately, most other sectors are not truly datafied, so to speak. I saw an estimate the other day that claimed that 97% of all data collected by hospitals is never used. Similarly, another study suggested that the mining sector uses only 1% of the data it collects. So, despite all the hype around data, it is still common for the data collected by many companies and government agencies to be simply thrown away. Sort of like, as someone said, burning piles of money or dumping barrels of oil down the drain because renting a warehouse is too much trouble. Really. This means that we have not quite seen the development of truly data driven business models and operational models in most parts of the government and private sector. What we see about data is just the tip of the iceberg. Governments, therefore, definitely see data as a major policy area. And as we spoke earlier, data privacy and protection have attracted enormous policy interest, but regulators of regulatory have also turned their attention to data monopolies and competition markets in which data-driven companies have arguably established unfair advantages. The concentration of data, particularly personal data, held by large digital platforms, is the source of clear worry among regulators. Concerns have also been raised about the extractive nature of many data driven businesses that objectify or commodify the daily lives and activities of people. And it is done not just by private companies, but also states that increasingly use invasive private and public data collection systems to gather data about identities, beliefs, behaviors, and other personal details, using capabilities for probing, monitoring, and tracking people, and even influencing their behavior. You basically can't walk down a street now without a neighbor's security system recording your face and sending the information to a provider, possibly in another country, that conceivably uses unsafe data practices and whose government can demand access to this data at any time, or that actually sells your data to third parties without your consent, so that your supposedly confidential visit, for example, to an oncologist leads to an increase in your premium even before your wife knows you might have cancer, just because you were carrying a mobile phone with location services turned on, not without your consent. So, what might a policy response look like in such a world? One framework that I have used divides data policy into three tiers. One that looks at data as the essential infrastructure. Two that focuses on policies that help develop trust in the data ecosystem. And three policies that help society, government, and businesses derive value from data. So the first tier, data as infrastructure, covers policies that help manage data, including its collection, preservation, storage, access, reuse, archiving, and the like over the lifetime of a data asset. These policies ensure that all parts of the population have access to this data and that technical systems are in place to use data lawfully and safely. Cybersecurity is obviously important here as well. The second tier, policies that help develop trust in the use of data, include data privacy and protection, the ethical use of data, appropriate competition IP policies that help create fair data markets, clear provisions for data sharing within and outside organizations and across international borders, and strong institutions that can impartially enforce and develop data policy and regulations. Some policy areas, such as data protection, are well established, but others, such as data ethics, are still under development, even in the most advanced countries. And finally, a third tier, policies to derive value from data cover issues such as data innovation and entrepreneurship, data literacy, data and civic engagement, digital taxation, and the like. Digital literacy and capacity is especially important, and it goes beyond technical proficiency. What you need is to make sure that business leaders understand data driven business models and operational processes, that regulators have a good sense of how data products and services are different from similar preceding products and markets, and that consumers like you and me and citizens understand their data rights and demand appropriate protections when engaging with data. Otherwise, it's very easy to get everything wrong. COVID 19 provides a classic example to illustrate the lack of readiness of governments to collect and manage related data. Take just contact tracing applications as an example. Very few governments truly understood how to develop and roll out such applications, both from the technological and also from the adoption perspective. And that's before we get to risks such as surveillance and the loss of privacy. No wonder that one newspaper article recently described a contact tracing application in a Western European country whose number of developers actually exceeded the number of downloads the application got. This three-tier framework is just one of the ways of looking at data and data policy. And my main goal in presenting it here is to make the point about thinking of data policy as not just a single discrete item, but as a series of different policy questions that intersect with each other, acting variously as enablers and safeguards. A sound data policy must be holistic and go beyond hot button items like privacy and security and cover a wide gamut of questions. That said, fundamental disagreements remain about most of the nuts and bolts issues of data policy. Take data localization as an example. Technically speaking, you can easily move and store data across borders. For proponents of free markets, this is a good thing. Free movement of data allows companies to access global data and deliver it to consumers worldwide using the cheapest and most efficient data infrastructure, regardless of location. However, many governments restrict the movement across borders of sensitive government data for strategic and security reasons. And increasingly, governments and regional bodies are looking to ensure that if other data, such as personal data, is moved across borders, it is subject to protections at least equivalent to those that would apply in the original country. Some countries have taken the so-called middle path, in which regional data pools or data spaces allow somewhat greater movement of data, but not at global scale. The jury is still out whether such controls are good or bad for society and the economy, and the evidence base on both sides of the argument is still evolving. Let's actually talk about it afterwards if you really want to know what I personally think. The evidence base is quite poor, actually. The data ownership is another similarly contentious area, with many holding that the very idea of data ownership is nothing but a distraction that has no legal merit, while others argue that we as unconscious individual producers need to have greater rights over data and its commercial benefits. IP and digital taxation are other similar topics that require further work for which universal frameworks don't quite exist, despite the talk that you might hear. More worryingly, data policies still don't focus adequately on traditionally underprivileged sections of society, especially women and children and marginalized groups, including tribal populations, non binary gendered communities, as well as linguistic, religious, and other ethnic minorities. Take refugees, for instance, which is a big problem right now in Europe and elsewhere. They are frequently subjected to data collection by government and non government actors, but their consent is rarely sought, and they are most often unaware of data rights and the uses to which data about them is put to. Similarly, LGBT people are generally invisible in data surveys, and no reliable statistics about them exist. When information is collected, it is generally in the context of monitoring by law enforcement agencies. Tribal and indigenous populations too often experience data collection as an instrument of oppression, actually, and are especially sensitive to what has sometimes been described as data colonialism and the fear that international firms and foreign actors will end up collecting and owning or appropriating vast amounts of data about a country's citizens and other assets, leading to what is called a loss of data sovereignty. Linguistic minorities face daunting disadvantages as well in the online world. According to one estimate, 60% of the 10 million most popular websites on the internet are in English. Hindi, which is my language and spoken by more than a billion people, has only 0.1% of these websites, with other regional languages like Bengali or Urdu not even appearing on the list. Think of how hard it makes to develop AI driven services in local languages when most online content is in foreign languages. Women and data policies have a similarly fraught relationship. One survey suggests that there are still 250 million fewer women online than men. And when they do go online, women are disproportionately doxxed and censored. Children, on the other hand, lose agency over their data even before they're born. Some numbers have say that 81% of the world's online children have an online presence before they're 2 years old. A third of the women of the world's children are born digitally before they're 6 months old when their parents post their photos online, frequently within minutes of their birth. And almost a quarter of children start their online lives before birth when their parents upload their prenatal sonograms to the internet. As they grow older, Children are routinely subjected to gross violations of privacy, with some of the world's largest corporations collecting data about them, either without their consent or them understanding the stakes involved. There are unfortunately no easy resolution to many of these issues, though international and regional agreements and standards have begun to emerge. Political and ideological differences have led to a fractured data world. Countries at different stages of economic development face different challenges, and there is no one size fits model that can be uniformly applied. I'll be happy afterwards to have a discussion of different policy choices countries face given their different levels of technical and economic development, the wide differences internally within regions, different sources of existing traditional competitive advantages, and leadership in different sectors, their different financial constraints, their differing legal and policy environment, and the strength of the capacity of the institutions, people, and leadership. Meanwhile, let's close by reminding ourselves that we are at the very beginning of the data revolution. The first wave, the data revolution, has produced a large number of corporations and countries that we see as winners of the data revolution. These companies have translated their mastery of personal data and online commerce into pretty dominant positions. But this is not the end of the story. We should expect that most companies at strong levels of mastery right now, their domination will cease, especially as most traditional sectors start to become more sort of datafied. Uh, if you have a dominant competitive advantage in a non-digital space, you might still be able to ward off uh, these digital firms, or new digital firms might still come into play. And data policy is going to have a big role in determining who wins and loses. Let's see where the world takes us from here. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your attention. Thanks again. Bye.